I'm waiting to see who he's talking about. The World GeoHistogram grew out of the brain research that we were doing. And I asked around in the room here to find out that it is what we call a dumbbell-shaped curve. There's a group of people who have used the World one, are familiar with it, know what it's all about. And then there's a group of people that haven't heard about it at all. And it's going to be very difficult to craft an explanation that fits halfway in between, so I'm not even going to try very hard, except for these 3 sentences. That what this is a graphic device to aid memory. And I will model a use of it in this room that the World GeoHistogram does not allow to have happen very easily. So even the people that are familiar with the World one are going to see something that is different. That's cool. The brain research summary in 3 sentences is that we do not read a visual image through a simple linear pathway. A visual image comes in and it gets broken apart and sent to at least 4 different brain areas that encode a location in a different way. So if I tell you, and I'm going to model how you can use something like this on the wall, either make one of your own, it's very easy to do, you know, just shine it in the wall and trace it. It's a simple graphic device here. And then you can say, well, now the gold rush was around 1850 over here in the Pacific region. And it led to a rather rapid increase in population right there. The population literally tripled in 3 years. And therefore that band got a whole lot wider within a 3-year period. Now I've just pointed at that thing. And I'm hoping that that camera, which is now racing off in a different direction here.
It doesn't go in the direction
it actually was looking at me.
Dave, any way you can get the camera on, Phil?
Working on it.
Is that working?
Okay.
I hate this thing.
Electronically. Now he's doing it the brute force way, which is the old physical that works, you know.
Take the microphone with him, too.
If I point right there, the point about the graphic organizer is that different people in the room will process this thing through a different brain network consciously. Some people will remember it as being toward the left and kind of toward the bottom of the box. And that is a brain network that we've got. And we needed it back in the hunter-gatherer days. I mean, this is all logic, neurologic. Other people will say, oh yeah, it's near the bottom of the pink area there, and they're processing it through the back right-hand side of their head, and other people are processing it in between. And I will leave it that for right now. I will simply say, like any graphic organizer, people actually process it through different brain networks, and they will remember it using different clues. And that doesn't matter. A good graphic organizer allows that to happen. And the World GeoHistogram, at least, we know is a good graphic organizer. Something like 60,000 copies of it have been distributed already, primarily by word of mouth, because it really works. And the people that have used it are nodding their heads in this room here. What we tried to do was come up with a US GeoHistogram. The problem is we don't have empires like the Roman Empire that occupied a particular part of the United States and then disappeared. We don't have, you know, the Mongols. We didn't have that. So we need a different metaphor. And the one we came up with is explained in the PowerPoint. And you'll get the PowerPoint. You might find it useful to look at the World PowerPoint because it's got a little bit more of the background of the neuroscience, and then just look at it for background information. But I put a lot of that in here, and those of you that have seen the World PowerPoint will recognize a few of these frames exactly. The rationale is very simple. The more engaging we make the individual experiences, the videos, the simulations, the games, the photographs, and so on. The more important it is to put it in perspective. When I do this for the World one, I've got a very simple story to tell. We showed a wonderful video to a group of New York students about the Mongols. And then we asked them a month later to write about the Mongols, and they could write very evocatively of what it felt like to be a farmer, with a wooden rake watching a horde of Mongols coming over. They got the affective, right? The emotional part of the Mongols. Then we asked them what continent were they on, and they didn't know. And then we asked them a question that I still remember. Were the Mongols about the same time as Moses, Muhammad, Mansa Musa, or Martin Luther King? And about 25% of the students picked each one of those choices. In other words, roughly a quarter of New York students thought that the Mongols were at the same time as Martin Luther King. That was the reason for the geohistogram, was just to be able to point at it. Otherwise, you can show them a video about the gold rush. And if you don't tell them it's way out west and it's a long time ago, some of them are going to think the gold rush was at the same time as Martin Luther King or Henry Ford or whatever. So it's just a graphic organizer, but it is a brain-friendly graphic organizer. So what do I mean by that? The box has got a shape that actually goes back to the Greeks. This is the so-called golden section, because this is the shape that is the easiest for the brain to remember. Space goes from left to right because most of our maps are arranged in such a way that west is at the west end of the map and east is at the east end of the map. And so we don't argue with that. That literally is the logic of the design. We try to design a graphic organizer that will seem logical, but they don't have to think about it. Time goes up from the bottom to the top, just like rock layers do. The first layers are laid down at the bottom, just like archaeological artifacts, the oldest ones are at the bottom, just like the papers on my desk. If I want to find out what I was working on in August, I just have to dig down about 9 inches. And the high layers press the bottom ones, which is exactly what happens in geology. In other words, this is logical, and it just fits. Now, if you want to know what the research is that backs that up, I will put a little bit of that up here, because there is a whole lot of research. Because this grade starts in 5th grade, we're making it simpler than the World GeoHistogram. But the World GeoHistogram has 7 categories, and we just chose to go with just 5. You can keep track of it on your fingers. It's that younger kids don't have as many storage areas in their heads. So, and then we said, should we subdivide that more when we get up? And the answer was, well, we'll think about it. But right now, my gut feeling is, if they've already seen this a lot in 5th grade, then when they get up to 8th grade like this, maybe we just want to stick with it. And then I'll show you how you can use it. But if you want to talk about what is going on in the order mechanisms like that, I'll give you the research that backs this up. The states that go into the regions, again, there is a 5th grade activity about what are the Middle Atlantic states, because I hate tests that say, describe the differences between the Mid-Atlantic and the New England states. Because if you put the word Mid-Atlantic states into a Google search, you will get more than 10 different constellations of states that are depending on what book you're looking at. Some of them put West Virginia in it, others put Maryland in it, some of them put Connecticut in it even. I just don't like those questions because they're not fair. That they privilege the student who happened to find the right book. There is no such thing as the Mid-Atlantic states. So we put our map down in the corner here, but on the clickable, you can put the map on or off as you see fit. We have 5 big regions: Northeast, Southeast, Great Lakes, Plains, Pacific, because we got 5 fingers. There's no other logic to that at all. That's pretty powerful logic. It's why our numbers go up to 10. It uses color to show roughly how important each region was. We'll talk about that in a minute there. Importance is defined as a combination of population, wealth, and political clout. And it actually is a pretty sophisticated mathematical equation. You don't want to see the equation. But it is the population, and it is what the Census Bureau said was the average income, and it is the number of representatives that they've had times the number of years each representative had been in their position, because we know that places that have had representatives there for a longer time have more chairmanships and things like that. There is an equation underlying the width, but you could spend all time debate. And in fact, I would encourage this debate someday in February where you just don't want to do what you plan to do. Have them debate whether the widths are the right size at a given year and what evidence you would have to get to figure out whether they are. Now, what do I mean by the right size? Well, because the Geek Note tells you that people do have the notion of enclosure and landmarks and spatial working memory and all this other kind of stuff that underlies this. That is, there's a lot of neuroscience behind the diagram, the way it's designed, so that it works without needing some explanation. West to east, old to new, colors are chosen for a reason, widths are chosen for a reason. Oh, we got even more data. So what do I do with this thing? Well, one thing is you put points on it. Anything that's got a date and a place, you can put here. And I can put Jamestown there. You know, the first settlement of the region that gets called the Southeast. Make sense? The brain encodes that, like I said, in multiple ways, relative to the colors, relative to the box outlines, what it's between. All these prepositions are stored in a different place. But I'm happy if they remember it's kind of at the bottom right-hand side. Now, that's called parallel encoding, and there's all kinds of brain research. There is a layer on the clickable version that has some of the native tribes there, and these deliberately use the native tribe names that the natives would prefer that you use. In other words, they hate Iroquois. They really hate Sioux. Sioux means something like slimy snake. And they are the Lakota or the Dakota and so on, the Diné. Whereas the Cherokee are perfectly happy being called Cherokee or Tsalagi. You know, that's their name. So, like I said, you can put any point on here. I have put what is arguably the first European settlement in each of these regions. One of the sands, of which about 10 of them got built in 1 year. San Clemente, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, so on. Santa Fe was a bit older than that. So there's one use of the GeoHistogram. Take the codes away and ask them to name them. Some of the kids are going to arrange them from east to west, and that is progress, isn't it? If they know that Santa Barbara is west of Santa Fe, is west of Detroit, is west, and so on. So, how do I remember where Santa Fe is? It is the second one. That is a relative statement. It's a comparison. It's in the lower left corner. That's an absolute. And there's actually a glick that talks about absolute and relative location. So we're reinforcing that. And there's a glick there for a reason, because your brain processes them both at the same time. You're only aware of one of them. And here's the problem. The one you're aware of might not be the one that every kid in your room is aware of. In other words, if you think of Santa Fe as being the second from the left, at least a third of your kids are only remembering Santa Fe as the lower left corner. You need to use language that is not comfortable for you some of the time. Does that make sense? I'm looking at you because you're the one that at that table that didn't play with the world one. You know, that you need to use language that is not comfortable for you some of the time, because some of your kids just can't process sequence as well. They just don't think that way. Preferably, they do, but it's way in the back of their mind. This is where the aha comes in, is when somebody notices, wait a second, Santa Fe was the same time as Jamestown. Because at least the way half of our texts are written, you don't get that idea at all, because you don't read about anything other than the French and Indian War and the Jamestown. We're doing that right now, by the way, in 5th grade, trying to get them to realize that the French and Indian War wasn't the French and Indian War. It was the French and British and Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch War, and they were happening all over the world. And we just happened to get caught up in the middle of one of them. We, meaning the people that happen to live on this continent. So, what are the big events? What is this event right here, where this suddenly increased in size? Or what's this event here? And that's one thing you can do. I'm not going to go any further than that here and now, other than just to say the PowerPoint does do that. The Northwest Ordinance opened up this area, and it suddenly started to expand fairly rapidly. The Louisiana Purchase opened up that area. The Gold Rush opened up that area.
Just to clarify, when the World GeoHistoGram goes over and crossing continents, and that's not the case here. Like, they're not going into other territories.
Right.
Okay.
Repeat the question, please, Phil, for our viewers at home.
She said the World GeoHistoGram was talking more about the separate continents, and that we had a nice physical thing called the separate continent, and that within the United States one, we have to do a different kind of regionalization. And we've deliberately made these regions a little fuzzy. I make that a case to be made. Is Missouri a southern state or a northern state? Well, that turned out to be a political issue of the middle of 1800s. Is Denver a western state or an eastern state? Colorado. What kind of state is it?
I understand the Gold Rush Louisiana Purchase. I don't understand the Civil War.
Well, the effect of the Civil War
Southeast and the North
was to drastically reduce both the population and especially the wealth, and even more than that, the political clout of the South.
I have to remember it's about all three of them.
It's about all three. And that one, by the way, the percentage drop is fairly well documented. We've got pretty good idea how much wealth was there prior to the Civil War and then what was there afterwards. Because one of the big winners of that was, in fact, the Midwest and the Great Plains.
And then the Exodus.
Yeah. Huh?
For jobs, right, for the free blacks.
Again, talk loud enough and then they can hear it, then I
The
don't.
Exodus of the free blacks to the north to work at that.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And we will take a look at that a little bit further. So the Dust Bowl was a radical drop in the political clout of the Great Plains. Not just loss of population, but loss of wealth and loss of political influence. The populist uprising had the effect of taking a lot of committee chairs out and replacing them with young people that had relatively little influence in Washington. And I think the oil embargo has got to rank, because what the oil embargo did is give back to the mountains and the plains a lot of clout, particularly Texas. To me, it's inconceivable that we would have elected a president from Texas and a vice president from Wyoming if we hadn't had something that suddenly made that part of the country wealthier. Both Wyoming and Texas gained tremendously from the oil embargo because the price of oil went up, but your pump was already done. It was in the ground, it was pumping oil. All of a sudden you were getting $40 a barrel for it instead of $7. That's a lot of money. Koch brothers are still around spending that money. Bunker Hunt and T. Boone Pickens and some of these dudes. Okay, so I did that with big events, but you can put anything on here. Dollar diplomacy, I don't know. I was asked by the Smithsonian to do a lesson about dollar diplomacy. And it's a really tough topic to make interesting. You know, but it's out of your range. Teddy Roosevelt and all that kind of stuff, it was hard. But one thing that the dollar diplomacy was it subsidized people from Eastern factories and Midwestern. It explicitly refused to subsidize cotton exports because the South was at the table, but it just didn't have any clout when it came to the fine print. Again, it's hard not to talk about what's going on in Washington right now about who has clout with the fine print of the bill that's being worked on right now. But part of this is just who's at the table at a given time in history to help shape the national policies. And at the time of dollar diplomacy, it was the Midwest and the Northeast. And the others were relatively weak. So there's the cotton gin. Look what it did for the wealth in the South. Look what barbed wire did for going out onto the Great Plains. Or you could put Frederick Douglass on there, or you put anybody you want on there. If you do this, the kids are encoding. Oh yeah, Al Capone's in the middle and he's after Henry Ford. In other words, this is getting encoded kind of subconsciously. And every time you point at it and add something to it, they will keep encoding it with what they, especially if you say it, you know, Al Capone's after Henry Ford. So there's a bunch of activities. This is novels, you know, The Jungle, Little House on the Prairie, Gone with the Wind, Huckleberry Finn, Grapes of Wrath. And then they put the little book on different places. They find out where was it written, when was it written, what's going on around it. So there's one activity. There's an activity already written about inventions, explorers, migrations, strikes, protests, so on. I've got a few copies of the printed activities, but the whole packet of activities is up on your website. And I gave you a couple as a sample. So I could look at immigration, right? What's the language that we would use? An arrow. People were coming from Northern Europe to there. Who else was coming in about the same time? Well, we had some Spanish people coming into Santa Fe and Santa Barbara and San Clemente and Santa Cruz. And we had African people coming against their will. PowerPoint's got the word Africa written down there, but we got a bunch of junk on the screen here. What are some other migrations that I could put on here with an arrow to help them? Because kids will kind of remember Africans came mainly to the south. People from Northern Europe came to both the northeast and the southeast. What's another migration?
Asians to the west, but farther up in.
I'm working my way up chronologically, but yeah, I would get there pretty quick. The Chinese people coming to help build the railroads and work the mines. Right after the Homestead Act got passed, we got this swarm of people from Eastern Europe, primarily Germany, but Hungary, Poland, places like that, Scandinavia. And they would go where they could.
When did the Dutch come in?
When was what?
When did the Dutch start blocking it?
There's exactly the kind of interrogation question you want them to do with this, and then we would come and find that. And we're actually doing a lesson on 4th grade about the Dutch, because there were 3 waves of them. You know, there was the very first one that made New Amsterdam and Albany and Rensselaer and places like that, up and down the Hudson River. And then there was the wave that came to Michigan here. I don't know off the top of my head, but Carol's sitting in the next room. You can go ask her. She knows everything I don't know, which is a lot. Eastern European people came in a little bit later on, and they found out that lots of the homesteads were already claimed, and so they wound up working in the factories of Pennsylvania and the mines and things like that. That's about when my grandmother showed up, the Russians out to the Great Plains. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, basically 1913, about the time of the revolution. Roughly 1 million of us left the lower Volga River and wound up out in the Great Plains. And that one can be spread out a little farther. The world history class can, of course, go back to figure out what was going on in all those places to bring them over. And we'll talk more about immigration a little bit later on. American history, we want to look at the specific acts that triggered some of these things, like the Asian Exclusion Act and the Homestead Act and things like that. You put those on. But students can add their own biography to this with an arrow. This is when my grandmother showed up. And you can add specific facts. So if you're in Detroit, you're going to have 2 waves of Arab migration, the Lebanese, Levantine coastal Arabs that came primarily in the 70s, and then the Iraqi and Syrian that are moving in now. The only thing they have in common is the Arabic language. That first wave was highly educated, most of them college educated. The second wave has got very little education. The first wave was urban. The second wave is primarily rural. We talk about the Arab community in Detroit, but it's not. It's at least 3 communities. And that's what this helps you tease out. You know, when you want to do that, you could put the Dutch groups coming to Michigan on here. I will remind you one more time that one cool thing is to turn it into a review quiz. At any time, you can put something on there and say, what is this? And why do you think so? And you point at a particular arrow and say, what was going on, you know? Let me give you in 3 minutes one more way to use it. We haven't developed a story in your time frame yet, because I want your advice on which one you want. So I'm going to show you a story that is in the 8th grade, the high school time frame, right? Well, you'll see what. Do you know what that is? Huh? That there's a boll weevil. And the problem with the boll weevil, I keep running into that, yeah.
I'm moving it for you.
Is that the boll weevil swept across the South. Now, what they need to learn is when the boll weevil came across the South, it didn't just arrive. It came slowly. And the result is it wiped out cotton gradually. And it triggered not one migration, but 30 of them. And when the boll weevil got to Alabama, that was about the time, well, I marked it on the GeoHistoGram, about 1907 or so. Now, you guys probably know what that is, because that was happening right there in the Midwest at the time. So what we had was a huge migration from Mississippi to Alabama, triggered by the boll weevil pushing and the auto industry pulling. And what I'm doing is I'm telling the story, and the student is simply marking the story on the GeoHistoGram to kind of keep track of when and where. You see what I'm doing? World War I shows up, and World War I ends, and 600,000 soldiers come home. And we do something that was a good thing. We said, the veterans need jobs, we have to hire the veterans. The problem is, they had to fire somebody to make the job available. The Depression started for immigrants and blacks in Detroit about 1920, not 1929. Because they were fired so that people could hire the returning soldiers. But the Big Depression came along not too terribly far after that, and it was synchronized with an event that happened out here. So we put that, what was that? The Dust Bowl. And we all think about the Okies going to California. And there's a problem with that. And that is for every Oklahoman that went to California, at least 10 came back east because that's what their family was. So you had this huge migration eastward out of the Great Plains, as well as a migration westward out of the Great Plains. The Depression, you see what I'm doing is I'm using the geohistogram to keep the story hooked together as a graphic organizer. And that's basically it. I want to have a nice story set sometime around 1810. Some story that you have a hard time teaching that is not the Louisiana Purchase and not the Erie Canal, you know, somewhere in between, or something around 1840. And then we'll make a geohistogram story about that. So give me your suggestions. In the meantime, what we're trying to do just simply is to build a visual image of what happens later, higher, or west of, or east of something else, and how they might be related. So I don't think it's the only tool. I don't think it's even the main tool. It's just a really useful tool to keep stories making sense. So there's the first presidents. You guys can talk about presidents if you want. You see how they're just kind of bouncing back and forth between the Southeast and the Northeast, you know, basically Virginia and Massachusetts. And then we had this little period where the ping pong ball went between New York and Ohio. Or as we in Ohio say, 7 of the least distinguished presidents of American history. And what do you think is going to happen later on? Now we've got multiple regions, and the presidents are all over the place.
The South is really never regained.
The Southeast has never completely regained its political influence. And the Carter presidency kind of made it even harder because he just was not expecting the kind of buzzsaw treatment that he got when he got there, and was just plain overwhelmed by the political clout of other regions, including an ascendant West. And he was just too nice a guy, you know. That's I don't think that's at all controversial as a statement, right? He just didn't expect what was going to happen to him. Now, this shows the westward trend of political power in the United States. You could, of course, make it more complicated by putting on party membership and things like that. And that's sort of the point, you know? You can show anything that happened if you can fix it in place and time. And students will encode it relative to other things at the same time, or other things that happened before and after, which is like the whole point. So it's a brain-friendly way to help them organize knowledge. You can give them lots of copies in black and white. It works just as well. It can serve as the basis for some activities, and we'll talk more about that in January and actually do one. It's valuable to use with other lessons just to point, like the Mongols were here and Henry Ford was here and Al Capone was here. And if you take things off, you can make a test prep quiz out of it some of the time. And that was the rationale, and it's available in lots of different ways, including big posters like that you can mark on with vis-a-vis markers. Dry erase and have it on the wall permanently if you want. And Becky has given away, how many of the world ones have you given away now?
The world maps?
The big posters.
The world geohistograms.
Oh, quite a few.
Yeah, so if you do want one for the wall like that, bulk orders really matter. One of those is going to cost $40. When you make about 30 of them, they're down to about 22 or 23 bucks each.